Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I would like to begin today's session by acknowledging that I'm currently situated on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam people. I'll now pause so you can all take a moment to acknowledge the Indigenous territory you are currently located on and to reflect on what your presence there means for you and for others. I would like to thank you all for attending today's event. I'd also like to thank members of our team who are critical to the organization and effective delivery of our programming, doctoral students Atiye and Emily, and UBC Migrations Research Coordinator Douglas Ober. Before introducing today's guest speaker, I would like to draw your attention to a few upcoming events you may be interested in. As part of our Mobilities Research Group, and co-sponsored by the UBC Latin American Studies Program, Dr. Mimi Scheller from Drexel University will give a talk entitled Mobility Justice, Climate Migration, and the Lessons of Pandemic Immobilities on Friday, September 25th at 4 p.m. Also, the next talk in this public lecture series will occur on October 16th at 12:30 and be delivered by Dr. Daniel Hibbert from UBC's Geography Department. His talk will address Canadian migration during and after the pandemic to consider how admission patterns are changing and what we can expect in the near future. You can RSVP to these events on our UBC Migration webpage and can follow us on Twitter using @UBC Migration to receive information about additional programming. Today, UBC Migration has the privilege of hosting one of its own members for the inauguration of our Fall 2020 speaker series, Dr. Matthew Wright. Matt studied political science and history at McGill University prior to obtaining his PhD in political science from the University of California, Berkeley. He came to UBC's Department of Political Science from the American University in Washington, D.C., where he was an associate professor of government. He mainly uses empirical and comparative lenses to study political psychology, wanting to understand where people's political identities and core values come from and how they go on to influence attitudes about immigrants, immigration policy, and diversity. He is published in a number of journals, including Comparative Political Studies, Journal of Ethnic and Migration Studies, and Ethnic and Racial Studies, among several others. His book, co-authored with Morris Levy, Immigration and the American Ethos, is a hot off the press. So today he'll draw from his book to discuss what Americans want from immigration policy and why. We also have the pleasure of welcoming Dr. Levy today, who is in attendance. Dr. Levy is an assistant professor of political science at the University of Southern California. Dr. Wright's talk will last approximately 40 minutes. There will be no live discussion option, meaning that attendees' videos and audio will remain off during the webinar. However, we do invite you to use the Q&A option in Zoom to type your questions and to please save substantive questions and comments for the end of the presentation. There is an upvote function in the Q&A, so if you have a question that's similar to one that's already been posed, you can simply vote for that question, and Dr. Wright and I will moderate the discussion following his presentation. So I now invite Dr. Wright to begin his presentation, and thank you all again for joining us.
All right, thanks a lot, Suzanne. I appreciate that. Thanks for the invitation, and thanks to everybody for being here. So as Suzanne mentioned, this is a talk based on our book, and it's one particular piece of it. Now, let me just make sure I can click through here. Okay, now I'm going to be watching the Q&A while I talk, so you guys can ask questions, and especially if they're like clarifying questions or whatever, I'm happy to try to deal with those. I asked to keep the meatier stuff to the end. All right, so just as a bit of an overview for the book, which is pictured there, our main goal is to establish the importance of core values, and in particular what we call civic fairness values, as an alternative to the sort of predominant view of immigration attitudes, which is based on group-centrism or the idea, or group identity. So our main arguments, we make three different kinds of arguments throughout the book. The first is that what we call civic fairness values explain nuance in Americans' policy attitudes that group-centrism cannot. The second thing is that a lot of empirical patterns that are used and invoked in the literature to support group-centric theories are actually better explained by civic fairness values. And the third, upping the ante a little bit more, is that when civic fairness values and group loyalties come into conflict, the former tends to exert a stronger pull for most Americans most of the time. Now today, I'm going to be talking about the second one of these, and I'm going to be asking this question mainly: what is the anatomy of prejudice? And the meaning of that will hopefully become clear as I go through the talk. But first, I want to do a little bit of brush clearing. I want to talk a little bit about what I mean when I use terms like values and norms. So values I generally use in reference to overarching precepts or notions about worthy and unworthy aims or behavior. And so individuals bring all kinds of core values to their political attitudes, including things like their ideas about individual liberty, equality of ends or means, and things like protection of private property, cultural rights, and so on and so on and so on. The list is very long. Societies can reflect a fairly broad agreement or a broad disagreement on these values. When there's consensus, it becomes part of what people used to call, and people don't really use this anymore, but they used to call political culture, right? What the political culture is of a nation. When I talk about norms, generally speaking, I'm going to be talking about more domain-specific rules governing choice or behavior. So the values are the foundation, and the norms are the sort of behaviors that follow from the values underpinning. So, for example, somebody who strongly supports private property rights is going to take care to avoid trespassing on somebody else's private property, and they're going to be strongly in favor of the right to defend their own land against something like, government takings or whatever. Okay, a little bit more brush clearing. I want to talk about stereotypes because this talk is going to be all about stereotypes, so we should make sure we're all on the same page. A stereotype in my usage here is a simplified representation of a social reality. In essence, boiled down to a few key characteristics. So, for example, surveys often ask people whether they endorse various stereotypes about racial, ethnic groups, behavioral and or trait characteristics. Usually not to the point of like physical characteristics, like, to do with intelligence and things like that. So, for example, the American National Election Studies will ask whether people agree or disagree that different ethnic groups, the main ethnic groups in America, whites, blacks, Asians, and Hispanics, are hardworking versus lazy, intelligent versus unintelligent, and peaceful versus violent. And people are allowed to reflect on these and offer a level of agreement or disagreement, and that is the stereotype. Now, stereotypes, importantly, may or may not be based in fact. Okay, that's important. And one other sort of nuance on this is that it's not necessarily, when we link stereotypes to prejudice, which I'm going to do frequently, it's not necessarily about endorsing a negative stereotype that makes one prejudiced, right? Somebody's prejudiced only to the degree that they endorse a negative stereotype versus a social category, in this case, an ethnic or racial group, and not about their own group, right? So if they're signaling groups out or singling groups out in terms of some characteristic versus other groups, then that's sort of prejudice, right? It's the stereotype that say, whites are unintelligent. If somebody holds that stereotype, well, that's fine, but then we don't know if it's prejudice unless we know that they think more highly of other groups. By the same token, ethnocentrism, which is a word that we hear bandied around a lot, is basically the difference between how people evaluate their own group in terms of whatever stereotypes we might ask them, and the kind of average of all other outgroups or other groups that they might be asked to think about. So that's what I mean when I talk about stereotypes, prejudice, and ethnocentrism. All right. So now to the study of immigration attitudes, which is what the book is really about. Our main foil in this little exercise is the idea that immigration attitudes in the US are predominantly what we refer to as group centrist. Now, what we mean by that is we just evaluate what's out there in the literature, and the main claim that we see, and I'm going to give you some examples shortly, is that people make decisions about immigrants and immigration on the basis of us versus them. Now, a couple of examples, these are just from op-eds, right? Somebody from 2012 saying anti-immigrant sentiment is about Latinos, negative feelings towards this group drive anti-immigrant stances. Here's another one from Jennifer Rubin, Washington Post. The excuses for opposing immigration or for deporting illegal immigrants en masse no longer pass the smell test. Strip away the fallacious arguments and you arrive at an uncomfortable truth. This is largely about plain old bigotry. Okay, so that's the sort of us versus them reasoning. Now, the logic of that reasoning is that people have an entrenched understanding of who we are, and they draw a boundary around it. And then that there's this sort of impulse that people have to reward in-group members and potentially punish outsiders, and especially punish outsiders if they're seen as threatening in some sense. Um, there's consensus that this happens among people in the sort of group-centrist strain of literature on this subject. There's some disagreement about why it happens. So we have, those are a lot of just alphabet soup there. There's realistic group conflict theory is one version of this argument. Social identity theory is another version. Symbolic racism is another version. Social dominance orientation, and so on and so on. So it's a lot of different spins on the same underlying premise that people's identity matters to them, their group identity matters, and that they will act in a way to reward their own group and possibly punish an outgroup. Now, there's one corollary that we would throw in here, which is that the information environment, which is broadly construed as just what politicians are saying, what's on the news, the media, et cetera, in a sort of big picture sense, is suffused with group cues, which makes this easy. So this is not a cognitively difficult process to kind of think about immigration policy in terms of ethnic groups, because the argument goes everything in the ether about immigration is going to reference ethnicity in some way. So people should have an easy time doing this. So this kind of way of seeing the world is by far the most common model one finds in the literature. It's not monolithic, but we see it kind of everywhere. One sort of strand is people who study race and ethnic politics. And so I just put in a number of books there that pick up on that theme. Abrahano and Heinal, Kinder and Cam's book on ethnocentrism, Jane Junn's book with Natalie Masuoka from 2011, Efren Perez, Ashley Jardina, which is actually the preceding book in the Cambridge book series to ours on white identity. And so there's all kinds of versions of that argument. Now, there's another strand of literature almost as prominent based on national identities, so-called, which also kind of picks up a lot of the same themes. So Morris and I's advisor, Jack Citron, wrote a book with Dave Sears in 2014 that sort of picked up on this. Eric Kaufman has a book called White Shift that came out last year that talks about it in this way. Debbie Schildkraut, Elizabeth Theis-Morse, Kara Wong all have books sort of along these lines. Okay, so what are we doing? Well, we're doing a slightly different thing. We're claiming instead, right, instead of applying group identity to weigh immigration policy, we're saying that, Americans apply core values, the set of which, we call civic fairness. I'm going to tell you more about what those values are in a second, but let me just set it up a little bit first. Now, in this model, people have expectations about what others, themselves and others, citizens, immigrants alike, owe their society and what they're owed in return in a sort of contractarian sense. Now, the logic of this is that people have an understanding of what they think the social contract entails. They draw a boundary around it. Some people are good contractarians. They fulfill their side of the bargain. Others don't. And there's a boundary that creates a different kind of insider and outsider. And people make decisions, in this case, about whether or not prospective immigrants or a group that immigrants are associated with qualifies as a valid party to the social contract or not. And so the calculus here, instead of what will benefit us in some sort of groupie sense, the calculus is what is fair? What do I view as fair based on the values that I'm bringing to the table? Now, the corollary here, similarly to the group-centrist model, is that the information environment is also sort of suffused with arguments about what's at stake in terms of people's values. So this isn't a particularly hard thing to do either. And I'll just give you one quick example from well, actually, no, I'll hold it because I'm going to show you a little bit of the content analysis that we did, so you'll see. But the idea is that when people encounter ideas about immigrants in the news, they do encounter information about ethnicity, so they can make that connection. But they also, sort of pick up cues about civic fairness, what immigrants are doing or not doing, as the case may be. Okay. So here it is in sort of more laid out in a kind of bigger picture sense, right? These are the values that I'm going to list you the elements of civic fairness that we're talking about in the book. Not all today. We're just going to do a subset of it today. We're going to talk about, the center column is going to be the policy attribute that's relevant, or the immigrant attribute that's relevant to that. And then we're going to talk about the values stakes on the right, like what kind of values are engaged. So one subset of civic fairness is what we refer to as functional assimilation. Now, functional assimilation generally refers to acquiring the native language, in this case English, education, skills, human capital, evidence of work ethic in a sort of softer sense. And that sort of thing is going to matter a lot for people who are economic individualists, people who believe in self-reliance, and so on and so forth. So functional assimilation is one sort of key thing. The second one is formal assimilation. So in contrast to functional assimilation, which is simply like how well can you get along in your adopted society, this is more about sort of status, right? So what is your formal status in that society, and includes things like whether or not you're a legal immigrant versus undocumented, whether or not you've gained citizenship, or if you're a long-term resident or LTR, and also whether or not you've sort of seemed to be respecting the rule of law, right? So engaging in lawful behavior, generally speaking. This sort of thing is going to matter a lot for what we refer to as procedural legalists, right? People who care deeply about law and order. Law and order is a kind of a, well, we'll get back to it. Okay, two more things I want to show you quickly. One of them is egalitarianism, and here we're thinking about whether or not a policy reflects ethnic or status-based discrimination, or something like second-class citizenship. And people who care deeply about equality of opportunity and status, that's going to matter for them. And lastly, I'll just mention briefly humanitarianism. That's the fourth element of civic fairness. And it's engaged when we think about, generally speaking, people suffering or having a hard time, right? So that's brought to mind with, in the case of refugees or forced migration, political persecution in some cases, also to a somewhat lesser degree, family-based migration. So in the States, a lot of the discourse about legal immigration has been about whether or not we ought to allow people to sponsor family members, and whether this ought to be reduced in favor of skills. This, in this case, that's a kind of we think of that as a kind of a humanitarian appeal. And it's going to matter for people who believe in that other people have an obligation to help others or alleviate distress. So Mohammed has a question saying, are these four elements mutually exclusive? I mean, not really. I mean, they kind of, if you actually, delve into it and say, okay, well, any given story about immigration is going to bring to mind a lot of these things. So yeah. So they're not necessarily, we want to separate them on theoretical grounds and try to draw lines, but of course in reality all of these things blend together. Okay, so let's move along here. Now, generally speaking, throughout the book and today too, these things in the center column are going to be things that we manipulate experimentally, whereas these are the kinds of things we measure as predispositions. And that's going to matter less for the talk today, but you see a lot of that in the book to sort of, just to give you a sense. So let me just, before I get into the specific empirics for today, let me just talk about generally sort of groups versus civic fairness in the vernacular, right? What do things actually look like? So one question that we asked in one of the surveys that we did was, how do Americans think about their country? Now, in August 2016, we did a survey of Californians, registered voters in particular. We can come back to that survey later. And we just asked them to complete this sentence. America is a, and we gave them a couple of different options for finishing the sentence. One is a country governed by laws that guarantee individual rights and say what the government must and must not do. That's a sort of contractarian, civic fairness-based approach, right? Generally speaking, you're looking at the nation as a social contract. 40% of our respondents endorsed that. The second option was a nation whose people are united by a common identity, heritage, and set of values. So again, to Mohammed's question, like obviously these things are not literally possible. You can't really distinguish them cleanly from each other. But this is more of a sort of groupist nationalist idea. And it's endorsed endorsed on its own by a far smaller, like single-digit respondents in California endorsed this idea. 26% of people said both, and 25% said neither. So a majority are saying either neither or both, which indicates that there's a lot of commonality between these things. Let's ask a somewhat different question. Oh no, I didn't show you the different one. Okay, so I'm going to move on. We did this a few different ways, and it always kind of shakes out the same. Okay, so how does the media cover immigration? I'll give you just a little look at this. For the book, we did a hand-coded content analysis of about 1,000 newspaper stories from 4 major newspapers, sampled at random from over 100,000 that we found published by a fairly expansive set of keywords between 2000 and 2016. Nothing sacred about those dates, that's just what we put in. And so we looked at 1,000 of those stories, and we looked for evidence of ethnic and civic fairness cues broadly defined. So we wanted to cast a wide net to see what these stories were generally about, just to kind of get a sense of what the information environment was. And we have 100% intercoder reliability because one of us, and I won't say which, did all of the coding work himself. And what did we find? Well, we found that 74% of the stories contained an ethnic cue, right? So the people who are in the group centrist strain of literature who say, it's easy for people to make a connection to ethnicity, Well, they're right. I mean, 74% of the time, stories explicitly mentioned an ethnicity of an immigrant, which was our sort of, coding criterion. On the other hand, 94% or even more, right, of all the stories we looked at reference at least one civic fairness value as I defined them on the previous page, right? They talked about formal assimilation, functional assimilation, humanitarianism, or egalitarianism. So 94% of the stories had some element of this, right? So even though like stories, a lot of stories reference ethnicity, the vast majority, even larger majority of them actually talk about civic fairness the way we define it in some capacity. Now, within the categories of civic fairness, 74% of the stories were about formal assimilation, mainly about legal status and illegal immigration. 38% of them were about functional assimilation, 26% were about egalitarianism, and 30% were about humanitarianism. Now, you'll note again that they don't add up to 100, right? So stories had most stories had a lot of different things going on at the same time. And so the upshot for our purposes here, I don't want to get too far into this because I'm not a professional analyst of media content, but all we need to say here is that ethnic cues are prevalent, but civic fairness is out there, it's everywhere, it's ubiquitous in these articles. And it makes sense when you think about that is what it is, whatever it is that immigrants are supposed to be doing or not doing, that's newsworthy, that gets them into the news to begin with. So plenty of civic fairness cues for people to work with also. Now, to the main question for today, what is the anatomy of prejudice? Well, here's an old quote that I've been using for a long time. I'm not going to read it out to you, but take a second to reflect on it. This is somebody who was interviewed, a supporter of Lindsey Graham, and one of Lindsey Graham's primary races from 2008, I think, 2006 maybe, I guess 2008. And basically, what it is somebody endorsing just a mishmash of stereotypes, conflating, Islamic, Muslims and Hispanic people, and basically claiming at the same time that, well, he's not a racist, but, look at all these problems I have to take care of. And, all these people are potentially breaking the law. They don't speak English, and I don't speak Arabic or Spanish. So if they don't belong here and they don't come here legally, I want to know who's here. So this is a complete mishmash of civic fairness, ethnic cues, ethnic identity. The one thing that we have no question about is that they are prejudiced, right? They're prejudiced attitudes. Now, let me just bring it up to date a little bit more. You guys, I'm sure, saw some of these. I'll show you some more later, maybe. Firstly, there was this thing that Trump, when he came out, when the last time that comprehensive immigration reform almost turned into something, Trump basically vetoed it at the last minute with this sort of statement of, immigrants come from shithole countries. We don't want them to come here. Pardon Trump's language coming out of my mouth. There was also this thing in 2018, right before the midterms, about caravans coming north. I'm watching the Democrat Party led by, no, I don't want to read it because, whatever, you can read it, it's fine. But you'll see, there's an obvious ethnic cue there, or a national cue. People know they're thinking about that Trump here in the tweet is thinking about, Hispanic people coming from outside the country. And there's also these references to like law and order, right? These are many criminals, entering Mexico from the US, and they need to be dealt with. Okay. So again, a clear instance of prejudice, right? Obviously. Now, negative stereotypes are important because they're politically relevant. And what I mean by that is they're connected to what you could call policy hostility. So we know from the American National Election Study that if you hold negative stereotypes about Latinos, that's going to be tied in some capacity to your desire to have less immigration, to ratchet up enforcement efforts, and to improve border security. The particulars kind of vary depending on the issue, but it's a pretty strong general pattern. The question is, why are they linked? Why does that relationship happen? And there's two different ways based on what I've been talking about that we could think about this. One of them is the group-centrist way, and this is what economists refer to as taste-based discrimination. In this model, people prefer their own racial group over others intrinsically, and they want to maintain their own group position and potentially lash out against a threatening outsider. So that should sound very familiar based on the group-centric account of immigration that I posited earlier. And so the idea there is that negative stereotypes essentially flow out of a group sense of superiority intrinsically. So somebody's going to if somebody dislikes Latinos, they're going to take on negative stereotypes. They're going to, on the one hand, sort of favor, take on negative stereotypes about Latinos, and that in turn will fuel their desire to have fewer immigrants if they assume, as most do, that immigrants predominantly come from Latino countries or Hispanic countries. civic fairness model is closer to what economists refer to as statistical discrimination. And here the idea is that anti-immigrant attitudes aren't intrinsically group driven, but rather they emerge out of concerns regarding norm violation, right? So in this case, functional assimilation. People have concerns that that immigrant groups are not functionally assimilating appropriately, and as a result, they sort of are wary about having more immigrants. So it can be the same, more or less the same stereotype. Let's say, you know, Latinos aren't speaking English, you know, or something like that. And it could either be because somebody has a group-centric desire to sort of keep Latinos down or keep them out of the country, or it could be that, well, they're just worried that they have nothing against Latinos per se. This is just about trying to keep, trying to, make sure immigrants are integrating as they should. So really, it's a sort of not an especially emotional um, assumption about groups' willingness or ability to integrate or assimilate. Okay, so obviously these things are intertwined, as I've been saying. It's hard to separate them because norms and values go together, right? Norms themselves are packaged and reinforced by social groups, and they evolve to facilitate coordination among group members and to bolster group positions. So it's hard to divorce them cleanly. They're also enforced, norms that is, by sanctioning of fellow group members. By the same token, you can think about norms as not being, they're not identity free, right? Norms are tied to people, the groups that people identify with. So it's kind of a mess. It's difficult. And at the level of individual psychology, it's really hard to tell when people confront a stimulus or a piece of information that cues both things, like some of those Trump tweets I was showing you what exactly it is that they're reacting to and why. Now, virtually all observational methods of gathering empirical data on this fail because they don't allow us to discern motivation. So all the stuff in the ANES and the GSS and that stuff, like feeling thermometers, measures of social distance, the stereotypes, like I showed you earlier themselves, it's really, really hard to sort of understand what the stuff of that is because they're just, they could be driven by both indiscriminately. Okay, so I'll just give you very quickly a canonical example of this, or a couple, right? This is Willie Horton. A lot of you guys have seen this picture before. And this is the welfare queen. I'm forgetting her name. I wrote it. Yeah, Linda Taylor. Okay, so there's obviously, so if you look at these images that came out a long time ago, right? Willie Horton was associated with the Bush the Elder campaign in presidential campaign in 1988. The welfare queen Linda Taylor stuff was in the 70s. I think it was Reagan that started bringing that to prominence. Both of them essentially were presented as two things: a racial threat and a threat to law and order. And we see the same thing nowadays when, or with respect to caravans, or with respect to even Antifa, and Black Lives Matter and all of this, right? So the point is, these cues produce different kinds of things in the same, different kinds of considerations potentially at the same time. And so it's really hard to say if you show somebody a picture of Willie Horton and they react in a certain way. It's hard to say, well, what it is they're actually answering. Okay, I got a question from Sarah. Can you clarify what you mean by statistical discrimination, meaning that attitudes are based on facts, or they could also be used as so that are not necessarily true, right? So it's based on assumptions. Essentially, what I mean by that is the statistical discrimination is based on an assumption about what a group does or does not do on average. So it may be true, it may not be true. It's an assumption, right? So a good example of that we'll be dealing with, explicitly in a minute, is whether or not Latino people, when they immigrate to the U.S., whether or not they learn English. So I don't actually know. Well, I'm not telling. I mean, I know, right? But if I'm some random person answering a survey, I may not actually know what the sort of objective truth of the matter is. It's a hard thing to know, but I will probably have an assumption about it, and that assumption is what we're concerned with. Stereotypes. It is a stereotype, right? But like, it can be based on truth or it cannot be based on truth. It doesn't really matter. It's as long as people believe it to be true. Okay. So more on the nose for today's topic. Here's more of some Trump tweets that do the same kind of thing. We don't have to read them all. It's just a collection. There are many, many others. Recently, he's turned his attention away from immigration and more towards BLM, but you see the same kind of stuff, just indiscriminately, in addition to indiscriminately capitalizing various words and misspelling things, using all caps. He's got these sort of like this spatter of, ethnic group considerations, as well as these like law and order, close the border, fund the wall, no more DACA deal, getting more dangerous, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so what do we want to do? Okay, well, in the book, what we did was this. The first thing I'm going to show you is we did an internet survey of California voters. Back in April 2015, it was almost 2,300 respondents. In this case, there were no Spanish language interviews, even though we did get some Latinos in the sample. We didn't have the budget for Spanish interviews. Now, in our experiment, we came up with 3 hypothetical immigrants. One was named Juan, who was Mexican. The other was named Yuan, who was Chinese. And the third was named Johann, who was German. They were all stipulated as such, right? So people didn't have to guess based on the name, but, so it was clear. All of them are described as 30 years old and living in the country illegally, okay? And our sample was randomized such that 1/3 saw, a prompt about Juan, 1/3 got Yuan, and 1/3 got Johann. As I said, their country of birth is specified in the prompt as well. Now, half of our respondents, again, totally at random, received no additional information, only that they were living in the country illegally and they were 30 years old and this is where they came from. Now, the other half of the people learned that in addition to everything I just told you, they learned that Juan, Yuan, or Johann, whoever it is that they read about, has learned English and is currently working as a waiter. So for us, this is a cue of functional assimilation. Okay, so what we're thinking of is like, we ask people then after that, should this person qualify for public assistance? Okay, so what we want to look for here is a couple things. Firstly, can we elicit ethnic bias against Latinos at baseline? So the observational surveys, you can elicit anti-Latino bias pretty easily, and you can demonstrate its consequences, its political consequences pretty easily. And the question is, can we do that here in this case? But the more interesting thing is, once we've elicited the bias, if we can elicit it, how does that bias respond to the added contextual information about assimilation, right? About functional assimilation. So if the biases persist, then that's evidence to us that it's taste-based discrimination that's happening, right? People are motivated to be anti-Latino, and as such, their prejudice against them is rooted in anti-Latino sentiment. And no matter what you tell them, oh, he's got a job, whatever, that won't matter, right? They'll either downweight it or they won't believe it or whatever. They're gonna get rid of it. Now, on the other hand, if biases are erased, that's a sign of statistical discrimination because that assumption of lack of assimilation is now being mitigated, right? If somebody's, if all else equal, somebody's assumption when they hear about a Latino illegal immigrant is that that person is not working, then they might be biased against that person. But if I tell them, no, actually this person has a job and is learning English, then that's a signal that that assumption, at least in the case of this one person, does not hold. And so if the bias gets erased in that latter category, then that's a sign that really it's not about antipathy against Latinos per se. It's really just about the assumption, right? The assumed lack of assimilation. So here's what it looks like. And I want to show you a couple of things, note a couple of things here. Now, on the x-axis, we've just got 2 categories, right? Whether or not there was contextual information was provided, and yes is on the right and no is on the left. And then on the right, we've just got, what percentage of our respondents supported, so it's not legalization. Oh, wait, was it legalization? All right. It may have been either benefits, availability, or legalization. Morris will tell me the answer later if he's still on. Anyway, so what happened was, okay, a couple of things. In the lack of, with a lack of contextual information, there is bias, right? We can clearly see that, well, okay, I'm gonna do that in a second.
Legalization.
Thanks, Morris. Appreciate it. I'm so glad you joined us. That's a relief. Okay, so the other one I think we asked about benefits, or one of our other many online surveys we asked about benefits instead, so I tend to often get confused. Anyway, so in the no information condition, we can see that there's a pretty strong bias against Latinos here, right? So Yuan and from China and Johann from Germany, they're supported at a substantially higher, and that's a statistically significant difference, versus Juan. Okay, so he gets a lot less support. Once you add the information, 2 things happen, right? First, all 3 of them gets more popular, okay? So that demonstrates that people value assimilation in and of itself, right? If you tell people about any immigrant that they're learning English and that they're working, they're gonna be reassured by that and they'll be more supportive of allowing that person a pathway to citizenship in this case. Now, the other thing we see, though, more to the point, is that the gap between ethnicities closes. Now, that difference is no longer statistically significant, and what that tells us is that anti-Latino bias exists because, in this case, people stereotype Latinos as less assimilated than others. Okay, so that ethnic group gap that exists in the no information condition is erased. And the fact that it's easily corrected indicates, at least to us, that it's statistical rather than taste-based discrimination. People don't seem especially motivated to maintain their anti-Latino prejudice. Now, for those of you who don't eat, sleep, and breathe experiments, remember that everybody who's answering this only deals with one hypothetical immigrant and only deals with one kind of information. Either they have the information or they don't, and it's all entirely at random. So that's what's driving this difference. It's purely the differences between across ethnicities and the level of contextual information that's provided. Okay, so let's look at this through in a different way. There's a couple of issues with what I just showed you. I mean, more than a couple, right? But there, a couple of the main ones. First is it could be that we're having problems because we have person positivity bias. Now, person positivity bias is simply the idea that people who answer surveys about individuals they generally respond more, even fake individuals in a survey vignette tend to respond a little bit more positively, right? So because they think they're dealing with a person, and that not only is that one person maybe not representative of the broader stereotype, but also that they kind of, in some weird way, kind of identify, right? Instead of asking a question about like, Latinos or people from Latin America or what have you, you're asking about Juan. Well, people are now thinking about an individual, and it's possible that that leads them to be a little bit more, to react a little bit more positively once we hear the information. The other thing that we were concerned about was ceiling effects. So a big part of this case is based on the fact that the gap squashes together, and Yuan, Johan, and Juan are basically indistinguishable in the information condition. But it's possible that we just, people are generally pretty favorable. Remember, this is California, where we did the survey, and most people already supported. If I go back to the, most people already supported. You see, like the maximum score on this is 100, right? So if the vast majority of people are already supporting the German and the Chinese immigrant, well, they can't really go up as high or as fast as Juan can, right? So it could be that Juan is playing a little bit of catch up, but it's only because Johan and Juan and Yuan are already well ahead. So we did another study, again, of California registered voters, this time with Field, which was a polling company in California, and we did it in conjunction with the Institute for Governmental Studies. And this was in October 2016. I believe the N was about 1450 or so. Morris, you can correct me later if you want. We don't need the exact number. But there's a large, subsample of Latinos in this one, and many of whom we actually, there was a Spanish language survey option. So that's going to allow us to capture Latino public opinion a little bit more faithfully, and not just sort of focus on whites. Now, the experiment this time was, instead of asking about a hypothetical person, we asked about a proposal that would allow 100,000 additional immigrants from either Latin America or Europe, depending on the condition, into the US annually. And so 50% of each of our respondents got each, whether they dealt with Latin America or Europe. Now, in this case, there's a couple of differences, right? We're talking about a policy instead of an individual, like whether an individual should benefit from something. And we're talking about numbers and groups and countries of origin rather than individuals. So it's a little bit different, but different in a way that I think, helps us and kind of complements the previous analysis. So half of our respondents in this case learned only the number, right, 100,000 people, and the region of origin. And the other half were told that immigrants would have to have held a job, they would have to know English and enroll in English classes and pass a criminal background check. So here we've got some sort of reassuring cues, both on formal and functional assimilation, that, people are, we're not going to just let in these 100,000 people, at random, right? We're only going to take people who, have held a job, know English, yada, yada. So the benefits here are that it's a policy-focused outcome, so it's a little bit different than what we did before. And the civic fairness cues in this case are actually policy-specific cues, right? It's not just has an immigrant behaved well or not, right? It's does the policy actually enforce elements of civic fairness that people care about? And lastly, that there's no sort of person positivity bias here, because we're just talking about faceless groups of people. The other benefit is that there shouldn't be any ceiling effects here. I mean, we assumed that at first, and later on we found out after we did the survey that we were right to believe that, since the overall sort of mean support for this policy was below 0.5 on a 0 to 1 scale. So like, this is not a sort of consensually popular policy, which is totally expected. Okay, so let's look at what happens here. Now I'm going to show you two panels, one of which, oops, everybody get that? No, just kidding. So I'm going to show you two panels, one of which is our whites only sample of respondents, and the other is Latinos only in Spanish and in English. And I want to just talk to, I mean, it's interesting, right? So here's what we found, right? Basically, same thing on the side of the whites, where we see whites without policy specifics is a pretty strong gap. They favor Europe in immigrant, an immigration policy designed to capture immigrants from Europe, much less so, or much more so than they do immigrants from Latin America. There's a pretty sharp difference there, and it's statistically significant. On the other hand, if you provide the policy specifics, in this case, a sort of reassurance that people are going to assimilate, that they're going to have background checks and all of that, that gap almost entirely disappears. And I believe it's either marginally significant or it's insignificant there, that 0.64 versus 0.61. Now, if you look over at Latinos, it's kind of interesting too, because you have a gap in the no information condition, but basically in the pro-Latino, pro-Latin America direction. So here we've got sort of pro-Latino sentiment from Latinos in a sort of pretty, and you could call that a sort of groupist response, right? That basically we want more people like us. And that's a statistically significant difference. Now, if you add the policy specifics here, that gap again closes. So in this case, instead of basically disabusing people of a stereotype that they might hold, or reassuring them in any case that the policy is designed to mitigate it, here what it's having the effect of actually making among Latinos making pro-Latino bias less. So it's a sign that these sort of cues work a little bit differently, but not unexpectedly in this particular instance. Okay, so let me just summarize a couple of slides here, and then we'll go to Q&A, which is always the best part anyway. So the link here, what I've shown you is the link between negative group stereotypes and restrictive policy attitudes is pretty widely assumed to be group-centric. That is to say, it's assumed by kind of taste-based discrimination or the desire to help an in-group at the expense of an out-group. That's the sort of assumption. Our argument and our evidence here demonstrates that in this particular case, it seems like the discrimination that we're able to sort of find and pick up looks more like statistical discrimination. So in other words, there's no obvious animus against Latinos per se, only a belief that they violate some norm, either functional or formal, depending on the evidence. And once you take that away, then the bias goes away, right? So in this case, policy favorability generally increases with reassurance about civic fairness, either individual level evidence of whether an immigrant is sort of assimilating or integrating, or policy level information about enforcement mechanisms. Okay. And the biases of whites against Latinos, either Juan or Johan versus Juan Johan, or immigrants from Latin America in the other case, disappears either entirely or almost entirely once we provide more cues about civic fairness. So civic fairness cues also seem to reduce pro-Latino bias among Hispanic respondents, which was a kind of a cool thing to see. Now, the upshot here is that civic fairness norms matter both in and of themselves, which you can see because all the lines slope upwards basically, and as a mechanism of linking stereotypes to policy attitudes. This doesn't mean that people aren't prejudiced. Now, I'm gonna talk more about this on the next couple of slides, right? It doesn't mean I'm not out here saying, well, people aren't prejudiced, we should all celebrate. What it means is that a lot of the prejudice that we can elicit isn't rooted in, on average anyway, isn't rooted in outgroup antipathy. So we can the fact that we can eliminate it with information is both significant on a theoretical level, and it's something that matters out in the real world, we think. Okay, so a couple of theoretical sort of notions to wrap up, like odds and ends. Firstly, some people might say, and this is an argument that we have with economists a lot of the time, we think this is really just people thinking in terms of economic man, right? Basically thinking, oh, this is really just people, assessing either their own job prospects or whether immigrants can contribute economically to the country. So there is overlap between functional assimilation and sociotropic economic judgments. That's true. Sociotropic, by the way, for those of you not in on lingo, just meaning that people are assessing immigrants based on their economic contribution. Now, the logic is simply that, well, what we're calling functional assimilation could just be people saying, oh, this person is going to be good for the country in some economic sense. I could favor an immigrant who speaks English and is highly educated, and so on, because, well, we want more of those types of people in our country because that makes us strong. I mean, it's possible, and there is sort of conceptual overlap in the big picture. And I'll punt to the book here, right? But like in the big picture, we don't really think this is what's going on. It's not. It seems to us to be more of a value judgment as we've defined it, rather than a kind of purely instrumental economic judgment. Now, another thing is it? So I got questions popping up, which is great. I'm gonna hold on the questions until I get to the end of the slides, and then I'll take care of them. I don't know what you guys can see and not see in the questions. I think you can see them. This is my first time on this platform too, so it's all a big adventure for all of us. Okay, so another concern is this sort of, what do we make of symbolic racial resentment in the sort of Sears-Kinder sort of view of the world? So theories of symbolic racism establish that values matter, but that the reason why they matter is different than the reason why we say they matter, right? So people like Dave Sears et al. will write, and more recently Mike Tesler and people like that will write that, values might matter, but only as a kind of a dog whistle that masks old-fashioned racism, right? People are not allowed they understand themselves as not really being at liberty to talk about group inferiority anymore, but they can talk about violation of civic fairness values. Well, in this case, it's unlikely to be a factor. I mean, throughout the book, we argue why this is not really this is unlikely to explain the kinds of stuff we talked about. But especially in this case, because group antipathy, if it were really about groups, then we wouldn't see the corrections that we see, and that's basically the core of our case here. We wouldn't see groups being, we wouldn't see the bias sort of persist with information if that information didn't matter, and it were really just sort of masking some deeper sort of racist attitude. Okay, exceptional context. Well, this is about anti-Latino prejudice in the United States and with respect to immigration. Our assumption is that the same kinds of cues are going to function similarly, everywhere in the U.S. Remember, these surveys are based on California, also beyond. Okay, so my general assumption, I think Morris as well would agree, that if you sort of like cue people about things like civic fairness, even in England or Canada or whatever, that's going to resonate strongly with people there as well. Now it remains to be seen, and that's part of what we're doing next in some sense. But we have no reason to believe ex ante that this stuff is not going to matter in other places. That said, we should be careful. Our surveys are based on California registered voters, so maybe people in other states you get a different pattern, maybe. Maybe in different countries you get a different pattern, maybe, right? And when I say different pattern, I mean, well, maybe you don't elicit the same biases in the non-information condition, and maybe the information doesn't do the same things in other places that it does for us. That's possible. I can't rule it out here. Another point to sort of make you guys aware of on a theoretical level is group exceptionalism, right? Whether or not this is really just tied to whites and the relationship between whites and Latinos and Latino immigrants in particular. So there's a big literature on African Americans in the U.S. and the relationship, the racialization of welfare attitudes, where I think it's fair to say the findings are a little bit, they're still disputed in similar ways, but like the findings are maybe a little bit stronger with respect to the group centrist side of things and the racialization side of things. But here I just want to acknowledge that different groups, it might matter to people in different ways. Another example is Muslims, where we've found evidence, and there's a lot of evidence out there in the ether, that there's a more strongly kind of group centrist antipathy, which is to say more likely to be rooted in racism and less easy or less feasibly dislodged with kind of like reassuring information. So I think these are possibilities, and they're fair, and there's some literature out there that sort of bears that out. So I'm making a case about the relationship between whites and Latinos that may or may not apply in a theoretical sense to groups that have a different experience and trajectory. Let me just close by talking substance a little bit. So outside of the kind of theoretical debate, I mean, there's an overlap here, but you know what I'm saying. First thing is, does what I've showed you just mean that we can just correct away prejudice in public opinion? Well, it's tricky, right? It's complicated because the truth of the matter is not always clear cut, right? So if you say, well, we could just tell people the truth and make them less prejudiced, well, a lot of the time it depends on perspective. It depends on, for example, like if you consider a common stereotype of Latinos as undocumented immigrants. Now, on the one hand, this is a ludicrous assumption because and this is all based on Pew data. It's all, this is based on something. There are about 60 million or so Latinos in the U.S. And, given that, most estimates of the undocumented population hover around 11 million, some say 14, some say 20, right? But like, it's hard to estimate, obviously, but, between 10 and 15 million people. Even if every single undocumented immigrant in the US was a Latino person, then 50 million Latinos out of the total that are in the country would still not be undocumented, or still would be perfectly, legal and often just citizens, right? So it's kind of ludicrous in that sense, right? To look at a Latino and say, well, obviously that person is an undocumented immigrant. But on the other hand, it's also true, and this is based on census data and Pew data, that if you were to pick a Latino a person out of the population and guess, is that person more likely to be undocumented than a white person, a black person, or an Asian person that you draw to the same population, then the answer is yes, that person is more likely to be an undocumented immigrant, even if most Latinos are not undocumented. So what's my point here? Well, my point here is that it's complicated. And so it's not so simple as to just say, well, we can say nice things and we can tell people the truth, and then people will be less prejudiced. So that said, right, once we step a little bit away from the idea of like correcting people's stereotypes, and we think more about how a policy could be crafted in a way that might reassure people about sort of assimilation and integration and all of that, the idea seems a little bit sounder, right? That we could say, well, probably more people will support, well, definitely, right? More people would support a policy on average that has a lot of reassurances about civic fairness built into it versus one that doesn't, right? So that's a step away from actually trying to tell somebody that their stereotype is incorrect. And that's on pretty solid footing. Another sort of standard caveat to throw away here is that the information environment, as you all know, is extremely polarized, especially so in the US. So we have to apply all the standard disclaimers about information receiving. This is in the sort of Zalerian, model, right? About people receiving information that disconfirms their stereotypes, and then even if they've received it, whether or not they accept it. So it's not so easy to just say, well, now you've done this study where you've told people about this, you've reassured people about civic fairness, so that's going to make them more okay with a policy. That's fine, but out in the real world, right, people might not see my policy proposal, and even if they see it, they might not believe it, right? Or they might not believe it if I say, oh, Juan is actually very keen on being an American, playing by the rules, learning English, working, all that. They may capture that piece of information, or they may not. Okay. So, another thing, last thing, I think, what about Trump and his base, throwing his COVID super spreader rallies out there and talking about locking people up and whatever. Nothing that we've said here disputes the notion that Trump is a racist guy, or at any rate that he traffics in racist rhetoric. In fact, I showed you tweets. You can interpret them however you want. I'm not making a case because I don't have to, right? I mean, he's out there, he's saying what he has to say. And I'm not disputing it, right? And yes, a lot of his followers are out and out bigots, which is to say they are, in the sort of economics parlance, taste-based discriminators. They are people who don't like immigrants because they are brown, or because they come from they are another. It has nothing to do with civic fairness for them. It's all about just sort of like racial superiority. A lot of work on white identity sort of builds on this idea. We don't dispute the idea that that kind of reasoning applies to some people, right? But what we're saying, this is why I said it carefully right up front, was that we're interested in average response in this case. But generally, when we write the book, we're interested about what most Americans think most of the time. So that's a neat way for us to exclude, the sort of viler, more deplorable elements of Trump's base, and say, look, I mean, these people maybe aren't motivated by civic fairness, but most people are, right? And on average, white Americans even seem to be. So our argument basically is that the sort of group-centrist approach is not necessarily wrong, although it's wrong in some cases, we think, but that in most cases it overstates both the prevalence and the predominance of racism in public opinion and ethnocentrism in public opinion as a core driver of immigration attitudes. But again, that doesn't mean that civic fairness appeals are going to work uniformly for all Americans. And there's already, I know that I'm reading the questions at the same time, and I can see that some people are already working along those lines. So that's good. Last thing I want to show you, in case you're bummed about 2020 or whatever, this has nothing really to do with the talk, but it just hot off the press the other day. Just a little bit of data about what Americans think about immigration these days. Because if the whole premise of the group-centrist idea is that people are sort of profoundly threatened by immigrants and immigration, and are sort of policy hostile as a result of that, well, let's see what's going on when you ask them. So this is a survey that the Pew Research Center did, and they released it. I mean, it was July to early August 2020, and they've been sort of releasing dribs and drabs since then. And what you can see is simply that, if you take, the interesting thing is the difference here between 2016 and 2020, and you can see that basically across the board, the pro-immigrant, the people have trended in a pro-immigrant and pro-Islam direction on both items, and rather substantially, right? So just to take one, among all voters, we've gone from 46% agreeing that immigration strengthens American society to 60%, a strong majority. And even if you look at Trump supporters, and this is what it was especially interesting to me, right? So, Democrats between Clinton and Biden have become more pro-immigration over time and more pro-Islam or pro-Muslim. But so have Trump supporters, right? So people who say, and this isn't Republicans versus Democrats, this is literally Trump supporters versus Clinton or Biden supporters. So Trump supporters, only 19% endorsed that idea that immigration strengthens American society in 2016, up to 32 in 2020 in the recent survey. So a little bit of a reason to be positive, and it's interesting to see that this is kind of uniform across party, that we're seeing a lot of movement in a sort of pro-immigrant direction. And this is something that Morris and I are planning on writing about soon, and we've written about a little bit, but that generally speaking, you know, Americans since the early 2000s have sort of moved in a secular sense, they've moved in a pro-immigration, more kind of welcoming direction, which is kind of it's an optimistic thing to see in light of, you know, everything that's been going on these days. So I wanted to leave you off on a little bit of good news.